In Essential Task 8.5b, we are going to continue talking about the central nervous system and add the final elements to our look at the brain. In this essential task, we are going to talk about what's called the cerebral cortex, which is the wrinkly outside part of the brain, the region of the brain that people most envision when they first think of the brain. But in addition to that, talk about a region known as the corpus callosum. So the concept map is the entirety of what you see currently projected. One box on the corpus callosum, and then the two sections of the cerebral cortex, the four major lobes, and then what are called association areas. I will return now to the task text, allow you to copy down the portion in yellow before proceeding into the concept map. We are first going to begin all the way to the left and talk about what's called the corpus callosum. Just to put into context briefly where we are, when we were last together in 8.5a, we talked about the limbic system, the thalamus, and then the brainstem/cerebellum. I alluded to in Essential Task 8.5a that we would eventually proceed to the right side of the concept map, which is under the whole header of the brain, which is in and of itself underneath the header of the central nervous system. But as I alluded to a moment ago, we will start with the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a large collection of axons, meaning within a neuron, so a bundle of neurons, that connect the left and right hemispheres. For the vast majority of people, the left and right hemisphere are attached to one another, meaning the left and right side of the brain. That's what the right hemisphere means. And as a result, the left side of the brain can communicate to the right side of the brain and vice versa virtually instantaneously. There are some unique circumstances in order to alleviate specifically epilepsy, where the corpus callosum, again, the bundle of neurons attaching both hemispheres, will actually be cut or severed on purpose, again, to alleviate epileptic seizure, epilepsy in general. It produces this really unique phenomenon called split brain patients. We'll talk more about split brain patients later in this unit and exactly what split brain patients tell us about the brain. But for now, we'll identify the anatomy. You do not have to watch the video in the left corner. I'm going to ask you to watch it later in the unit when we talk about the way in which the brain is studied. So more on the corpus callosum later. As a mnemonic, I look at the SUM at the end of callosum, and I think of the word sum as an addition. The corpus callosum is basically what attaches and adds together the left and right side of the brain. Without a corpus callosum, which again is directly in the middle of the brain, separating the hemispheres, your left and right side of the brain simply would not communicate with one another, which is in fact something that occurs, which, as I alluded to a few moments ago, we'll talk about later in this unit. From that point on, the remainder of the concept map is called the cerebral cortex. We're going to be talking about the outside wrinkly part of the brain, the part of the brain that most people envision when they think of the brain. We'll start with the four major lobes. You do not have to include diagrams into your concept map. We will draw a visual. We'll draw this diagram. We'll color code it so you don't have to draw one yourself. But nevertheless, if you notice in the top left corner, the cerebral cortex is color coded. The blue, the yellow, the green, and then this red tint. We're going to go through each of those four colors. They are four corresponding lobes. We're first going to start with the green lobe. So it's essentially, relatively speaking, close to where your ears are, which is convenient because the temporal lobe contains a couple different things. It's responsible for auditory sensory processing. So incoming sound waves are eventually processed in the temporal lobe, so it contains what's called the auditory cortex. It also contains what's called Wernicke's area. We're going to define Wernicke's area below, but I alluded to this the other day. Senses, which is a preview of Unit 10, but nevertheless, our senses are essentially a three-step process. Our ears pick up sound waves in the environment. That information pertaining to the pitch and the volume and the details of what it is that you're listening to are first sent to the thalamus. And then I alluded to the other day that the thalamus sends that message up to the cerebral cortex and the corresponding lobe for final processing. Well, auditory sensory input is finally processed in the temporal lobes. Damage to the temporal lobes could cause some degree of deafness, meaning your ears could be functioning properly, your thalamus could be functioning properly, but if there's damage to either temporal lobe, and you have one on each side of your brain, meaning there's a left hemisphere temporal lobe and a right hemisphere temporal lobe. Again, there are two hemispheres cut in the middle right down the corpus callosum. Therefore, there are lobes on both sides of your head. The temporal lobe, if damaged, could cause some type of auditory deficiency. This is the precise region of the cerebral cortex where auditory information is processed. As a mnemonic, I look at the word tempo and temporal, and I think about how in music there is tempo, and I use that as I think a pretty sufficient mnemonic. Additionally, on a diagram, your temporal lobes are essentially where your ears are, and I always envision somebody wearing a pair of Dre Beats and then having the beats line up directly with their temporal lobes. Below the temporal lobe box is the Wernicke's area box. I alluded to Wernicke's area a moment ago in the previous slide. Wernicke's area is one of the two pivotal regions today that we're going to talk about that has a direct connection to language. Wernicke's area is specifically related to understanding written and spoken language, meaning damage to Wernicke's area could cause you to no longer comprehend the sentences that you put together, the sentences that other people put together, what it is that you read, what it is that you write. You might be able to say individual words, you might be able to string words together, but there'll be no degree of coherency to the sentences that you put together. It produces a condition called Wernicke's aphasia, meaning you simply cannot understand language. I would like you to watch the entirety of the clip in the bottom right corner. It really is a fantastic visual and a fantastic example of what I mean by this. This individual is clearly able to put words together, but the words don't really mix. They're kind of strung out, fragments of sentences, fragments of complete thoughts. He simply can't translate what it is that he is thinking about into a coherent, put together sentence. He has essentially lost the entire ability to speak in the manner in which he previously had throughout his life. To be more specific, Wernicke's area is in the back portion of the temporal lobe, so further back into your head relative to the remaining portion of the temporal lobe, approximately where my arrows are pointing here. So that's the temporal lobe. The second major lobe is called the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe does the same thing except for vision. It is the final location of visual sensory processing. It is actually in the back of your head. So if you ever heard the phrase, eyes in the back of your head, it's actually an interesting saying, because the back of your head, at least relative to your lobes, the occipital lobe back here, is where final visual processing occurs. Meaning you could hit the back of your head and it could cause some type of, hopefully, temporary, momentary damage to your vision. You could go momentarily blind or have some type of visual impairment due to damage to the back of your head. So similar to the auditory cortex being housed in the temporal lobe, the visual cortex, which is the precise location of visual processing, is housed in the occipital lobe. Same deal with the senses. Your eyes pick up technically light in the environment, meaning it picks up details about the color that you're looking at, the shading, the shape, etc. That information is sent to the thalamus, as we talked about in 8.5a. The thalamus then sends that information to the corresponding lobe, as we are learning today. That lobe is known as the occipital lobe. Damage again to the back of your head in the occipital lobe could cause some type of visual impairment. As a mnemonic, when I look at the two C's back to back in occipital, I think about a pair of eyes, so I use that to think about vision. You could be familiar with body and anatomy, so you could think of the occipital bones. In addition to that, if you've heard the phrase eyes in the back of your head, as I mentioned a moment ago, that mnemonic does a good job positioning the occipital lobe relative to the others. The third major lobe is called the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe contains one very important cortex known as the somatosensory cortex. We'll allude to the somatosensory cortex more below. But it is here in the parietal lobe that the sense of touch is processed. You'll see a theme here where it seems like each lobe has a corresponding sense. That is partially true. The parietal lobe is the one that's sort of in the back of your head above the occipital lobe. So if you were to sort of touch the back of your head, but not all the way in the back of your head, you'd be touching your parietal lobe. It is in that region of the brain where the sense of touch is processed. Meaning, when you touch your fingertip, the stimulation there and the sensory neurons of your fingertips eventually go through the sensory neurons up through the spinal cord and are sent up to the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. And it is actually in that region that the sensation of touch is processed. You could theoretically have damage to the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. And although somebody might be touching parts of your body, you might not be able to feel it because that actual feeling, that sensation of being touched, is finally processed in the parietal lobe. The same way that damage to the occipital lobe could cause some type of visual impairment, even if your eyes themselves are functioning properly. So the key here is that the parietal lobe is where touch is processed, specifically because within the parietal lobe, it contains what's called the somatosensory cortex, sometimes called the sensory cortex. I prefer them call it the somatosensory cortex because the word somato means related to the body. And that way, when you see sensory cortex, you don't overgeneralize and assume it means more than one sense, which again would not be the case. The only sense processed in the parietal lobe is the sense of touch. As a mnemonic, I take the first part of this. This is a pretty common mnemonic within AP Psych, but I look at the first part of this word and I think of parietal lobe. And then if you think about a piranha, if a piranha were to bite you, that would obviously trigger a sense of touch. That would be an incredibly painful sense of touch. If you look at this word and think of piranha and think of the touch associated with being bitten by a piranha, you'll be able to connect the parietal lobe with the corresponding cortex that we referenced a moment ago called the somatosensory cortex. So this is the box right below where we just were. It is the only one on the secondary level below the parietal lobe. Specifically, the somatosensory cortex is located over here towards the left, so the actual region of the parietal lobe that I'm talking about is actually more towards the top of your head. But what's actually interesting here is there are specific portions of the somatosensory cortex, where my mouse is currently, that correspond to various regions of the body. So I can actually stimulate one part of your somatosensory cortex, and it will trigger the feeling of being touched in that part of the body, even if you're not actually being touched, for example, in your knee or in your ankle. There are larger regions in the somatosensory cortex for larger regions of your body that are more sensitive. So, for example, your fingers, your fingertips, the palms of your hands, your lips are way more sensitive as opposed to your elbow or your kneecaps. So there's actually larger space in the somatosensory cortex for regions of your body that are more sensitive. And again, you could see this called the sensory cortex. Unfortunately, when they do that, it's unnecessarily confusing because you might see that and assume we're talking about more than one sense, but that's not the case. The somatosensory cortex and the sensory cortex are the same thing, and we are both, in each circumstance, talking about only the sense of touch. So do not make that common mistake. If this is a bullet on the AP exam, you have to talk about feeling, touching, that sensation of typing and knowing where your fingers are. That is a touch sensation. The final lobe is called the frontal lobe. So just to note, there is this final lobe that has 2 on the secondary level before we talk about association areas. The frontal lobe actually has 3 things going on, so it's amongst the most important lobes, although they're all quite important. As you might anticipate, the frontal lobe is the one in the front of your head, so we're talking about this region here, indicated in blue. The frontal lobe enables muscle movements because it contains the motor cortex. That will be a box below. It is also where your planning, judgment, complex decision-making, complex thinking in general, abstract thought, all of those high-level cognitive functions occur in the frontal lobe because the frontal lobe contains what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is about the immediate front part of your forehead. Your frontal lobe is actually not fully developed at your age. It's not going to be fully developed until your early 20s, so I've only had a somewhat recently fully developed frontal lobe. There's a reason why it is not recommended to do things like drink alcohol at a young age because your frontal lobe is not fully developed. So decisions that you might make are already going to be relatively impaired just because this region of your brain is still developing. Use of something like alcohol can further impair judgment and decision making. In addition to the prefrontal cortex, which again is sort of the real direct front forehead portion of the brain that's not fully developed at your age, the frontal lobe also contains what's called Broca's area. We'll define Broca's area in a moment just below in the secondary level. As a mnemonic, I try to look at the second, third, and fourth word or letters here, and I see the RON, and I think of run and reason. Because this contains the motor cortex, which we'll define in a moment, the frontal lobe is what enables voluntary muscle movements and movements in general. So run is obviously a clear example of a movement. And then R in run, or R in ron in the case of the mnemonic here, I connect to the R in reason. The really 2 big functions here is to move into reason. Broca's area itself is usually easy to identify because the questions will give you the word Broca. So the function of Broca's area I don't include within the mnemonic. I'm really trying to identify run and reason. Those 2 clear R starting words I think would be really beneficial because it would tell you the 2 major functions. The motor cortex ability to move, and then this planning high level function, abstract thought. So to end with the 2 secondary boxes, we have Broca's area and then the motor cortex, 2 regions that were alluded to a moment ago in the previous box. Broca's area is the second brain region today that has associated with language, specifically though with the ability to produce the muscle movements necessary to speak. So your Broca's area is what allows you to trigger the muscles in your face necessary to pronounce words, to say letters, to actually do the process of speaking. If you were to damage Broca's area, as you can see here in this very short, about 1 minute clip that I'm asking you to watch, you would be able to understand what people were telling you, but you wouldn't be able to trigger the muscles in your movement to actually respond. This is Broca's aphasia, the inability to produce the muscle movements necessary to actually speak. As a mnemonic for this one, I look at the BRO and I think of the pretty common phrase, bro, do you even lift? Why? Because I'm trying to connect muscle movement in the context of language. There are 2 terms related to language, Wernicke's area and Broca's area. I don't have a mnemonic for Wernicke's area, but the bro, do you even lift mnemonic can connect muscles to Broca's area. And then at that point, it's process of elimination. One is about understanding language, Wernicke's. One is about the muscle movements necessary to produce language, Broca's area. And I think you're able to differentiate those quite well. The other region of the frontal lobe that's important is called the motor cortex. The motor cortex is the region of the frontal lobe that sends signals to control muscle movements, specifically by enabling motor neurons. So, for example, if you wanted to run across the room, pick something up, your motor cortex would send the messages via motor neurons to trigger those muscles in order to pick something up or run or do whatever it is that you're trying to do. Again, the word motor in this class always means movement. Motor neurons, movement. Motor cortex enables movement. Motor skills, back when talking about developmental psychology, movement, whether that's fine or gross motor skills. The final region of today's concept map are what are called association areas. These are all of the regions of the brain that we did not previously talk about, particularly in the cerebral cortex, that are not directly associated with sensory information or muscle movement. And humans have a ton of space for association areas. The overall quantity of neurons in our brain, over 16 billion, exponentially more than all of the other species indicated here in this chart, but virtually every other species on Earth, enable the really high-level sophisticated behaviors that humans can do, whether that's language, whether that's complex and abstract thought, you name it. The quantity of association areas is one of the major reasons why humans are so advanced in their cognitive functioning. Our brains, not only just by size are bigger than, for example, a mice or a mouse, but the fact that there are just exponentially more neural connections and more association areas ensure that our brain has areas that are not just devoted to senses. Other animals also need occipital lobes and also need temporal lobes and the equivalent. If regions of their brain are spent taking up those sensory-based regions, well, that leaves less space for the high-level complexities that humans get to do. So the fact that humans have more space in their brain and more neural connections open to things that are higher level, it makes humans exponentially more sophisticated in our behavior.